So, in this talk, I'm going to discuss an outline and an initiative that is very close to me, in so much that it aspires to instantiating within a certain tradition a form of life. There are kind of a number of ways in which I can speak about this, and ways I do tend to speak about it, but it kind of sometimes comes across as a startup or something discrete, a kind of discrete novelty. Whilst this may be an issue born of the kind of chimeric form in which it seeks to embody, it may not always be that helpful in its presentation. So in order to escape that, I wanted to begin not by speaking about it directly, but rather the cultural conditions from which it arises, and how those cultural conditions shape not just this initiative, but how it is prefigured as a component within an existing and emerging ecosystem or kind of constellation of things that may not be immediately obvious. And so when speaking about a kind of prefigurative politics, it makes sense to talk about what it is prefigured by. But more broadly in this context, and there was a comment that Ingo made at the beginning in terms of the framing of this, in describing these kind of objects and movements and initiatives at the beginning, and their potential relationship to a rise in libertarianism or crypto-anarchist politics, I feel that these initial points of reference could be important to consider. And whilst this list could be quite extensive, perhaps endless, depending how far back we want to go, hopefully these markers will begin to point to or outline what is intended. And so with that said, I wanted to begin with the kind of important kind of cultural conditions that give rise to these initiatives, but also my own, in order for you to maybe better understand what I'm trying to do and myself and my friends are trying to do. And so the kind of cornerstone of these movements and this work and this kind of innovation, I guess, is born of open source. I think at this moment in time, most people are familiar with what open source means, given that it's the kind of technology that underlays the internet and most of the services that we use today. But if you're not familiar with what open source development is, I'll just give a very quick definition. It's a development model that promotes universal access via free license to a product's designs or blueprints, and universal distribution of that design or blueprints, and which encourages the subsequent improvement of that design or blueprint by anybody. And this is typically related to software development, but increasingly is becoming something that affects the kind of physical world, whether it be through open hardware or the establishment of physical spaces or space technologies. Another important kind of precursor to a lot of the kind of technological innovation that we're seeing taking place, particularly in the hacker sphere, is the appropriate technology movement. This was very much an ideological movement in the 1990s that kind of began to die out, but generally it's defined by being technologies that are generally defined by being small scale, decentralized, labor intensive, energy efficient, environmentally sound, and perhaps most importantly, locally controlled. That is to say, technologies that are produced with a sense of universality for their application, where accessibility is emphasized over cutting-edge technologies. I'll probably have to go through these quite quickly because I feel like maybe I have to reduce the time. Relax. Go slow. Okay. This is a nice picture of Zuccotti Park in the winter time. So after Occupy, I think this is really, really important because in many ways Occupy is viewed as maybe a failure, but I think that for many people that were involved in direct action or politics before this moment, the real possibility of a kind of transnational politics, perhaps for a younger generation, seemed to come from nowhere. I mean, I remember seeing the advert for the Occupy movement in Adbusters and thinking it was hilarious. But I think that Occupy is particularly interesting because it is a very well-defined example of a kind of prefigurative politics where people try to produce libraries, healthcare, even on a tiny scale. And in that moment, a lot of people really came into contact with the limits of scale and what was possible, and were able to identify what the requirements of a second version of Occupy might look like. I guess in previous talks I've said the kind of post-WikiLeaks moment of like this kind of desire to shift to a moment of transparency, that in some ways that transparency was essential. But I think that what the kind of post-Snowden moment illustrates is that there's a much more complicated relationship between visibility and invisibility. And that this is particularly important to some of the initiatives and my own work, in so much that there's a particular class of people who grew up in their laptops. And so the Snowden moment is not so much about feeling the power of the state, but the total invasion of one's personal space. And this is enough to really upset a lot of people who control all the systems that run the world. I don't have much to say about climate change, but I think it's a very important subtext to everything that we speak about when we talk about political struggle, in particular displacement. Okay, so the initiatives. So I feel like this is maybe a good point to leap off to, because it can kind of be understood in relation to those various kind of cultural conditions that I outlined before. So open source ecology describes itself as a global village construction set. The aspirations of the project are to develop a set of pre-existing technologies, but within this kind of open source, open hardware vein, so that other people can replicate them and build on them. And it came about as a result of somebody trying to establish a farm, falling out of Silicon Valley, and being very confused as to why proprietary hardware prevented them from living a simple life. Lumio and liquid democracy. Lumio comes from a movement in New Zealand that's kind of constituted by a company of some sort. It's a very strange hybrid organization. Lumio is a decision-making platform that enables, it doesn't define the sorts of decision processes that you might be following. So it can work with majority vote, it can work with consensus, it can work with consent. Liquid democracy is a delegative voting system developed by the Pirate Party that allows people to give their votes to a friend or somebody that they consider an expert. So one person could hold the votes of 200 or 300 people. Now, we haven't seen this work at scale, but it did work for the Pirate Party. And although the Pirate Party might, in a European context right now, be seen as somewhat of a failure, it is particularly interesting to see that in Iceland it's now at 35% of the vote and is quite likely to take power. Okay, so everyone's probably at this point familiar with Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is interesting, probably most interesting because it represents the establishment of a decentralized central banking system for the internet that is not backed up by any individual sovereign power and cannot be taken offline easily, although there are proofs of concept for taking it offline. That in itself is interesting, and I don't think that in the next decade or so we're going to really know what that means. But what's more interesting is the underlying engineering platform that has enabled this thing to happen, that has enabled the decentralization of a currency away from a central authority. Now, if that system can be adopted and used for other things, such as identity, land registries, anything that currently a sovereign nation state is responsible for and effectively acts as a gatekeeper for, we have different kinds of problems to face. The name of that different problem is called Ethereum, which is the second generation of the blockchain. And it has taken the Bitcoin technology, and rather than just treat it as a currency, it has enabled programming to take place on top of the blockchain, which means that we can write smart contracts. To very, very quickly say what that might imply, imagine, given that the Internet of Things is becoming very prevalent in our lives, things like electronic locks on doors attached to databases. Imagine an instance in which the Ethereum platform is used to write a smart contract between you, your house, and your landlord. And the contract says that when you don't pay for 2 months, the lock automatically locks you out of your house. This is inevitably probably the direction that we're going in. Ethereum isn't all bad, but it does present some problems. I wanted to mention the Integral Cooperative because I think that it's the most successful governance or organizational structure, group, movement, culture, however you want to define it. Whereas many things like Ethereum and Bitcoin, they have this kind of synthetic feeling. The Catalonian Integral Cooperative has been able to really enter people's everyday lives and allow for people to subsist in quite a meaningful way. I wanted to touch briefly on satnogs because I think this is a good symbolic project. Given that space technologies have for a very long time been exclusively the reserve of the nation state, it's interesting to see the declaration of a move towards a hacker space program, and that this particular group in Athens, based in the hackerspace, have managed to reduce from $30,000 down to $5,000 the ability to build devices that anybody can speak to or communicate with satellites in the sky. Given that many satellites are still running Windows 95, this presents some security issues for the planet. Hackerspaces. This is the kind of most important reference point for moving on to talking about, I guess, my own work or the work that I'm involved in our monastery, because hackerspace is a very interesting model that developed in the 1990s in Germany as a result of the CCC, and didn't expand at all for the first 14 years. Essentially, a hackerspace is a kind of cooperatively owned space where hackers come together to work on their hobbies, build companies, etc. They're interesting in the fact that they've managed to grow to 1,000 between 2006 and now on an entirely decentralized basis. And I'll get to why that might have happened and why it might be interesting to think about how these forms might evolve, particularly maybe in the case of our monastery. So, does this all make sense? Am I speaking too quickly? Have I got enough time? Okay, so in 2012, 3 years ago, there was a strange gathering that was organized by the Council of Europe that, who knows how they did this, maybe it was the intelligence services, but they brought together a lot of young people because they were worried about the implications of high youth unemployment throughout Europe and the potential for this to create a politically unstable situation. And they managed to bring together not just young people, but a very diverse, strange mix of people, which ranged from policymakers, hackers, people that were very much involved in different movements that were taking place in Europe at the time. So in that policy context, we thought maybe we could design something that the Council of Europe or other cities might like, that might allow us to expand, but potentially most importantly, to create a kind of foundational layer that would create autonomy for the sorts of values that were found in movements like Occupy, hackerspaces, etc. And so the basic concept for the monastery is there are a large number of empty properties throughout Europe, 11 million, enough to house the homeless 3 times over. That might not be true right now given the refugee crisis. Austerity, so the rollback of state service provision as the result of a shrinking state, and high youth unemployment. So the basic concept was to take these 3 things and put them together in order to form some kind of solution at a local scale. So the idea was to invite people into empty properties, to revitalize those properties, and to work in collaboration with the local community in that area to provide services that would make sense to that specific geography. And the desire is to build a network of these spaces. So if you imagine, and the network thing is quite important, because one monastery on its own, whilst maybe quite effective and a nice thing to have in your town, if you have 20 who are sharing skills online and are able to call for specific skills to address difficult situations, then you have a very interesting fluid network of skilled individuals. Now, it's not particularly easy to live and work together, and that's probably why hackerspaces remain a kind of hobby club. So we thought that it would be interesting to draw on monastic tradition, given that for 15 centuries this has been a relatively stable way in which to cohabit. It's probably important at this point to say that a monastery, the in unmonastery means no god, no hierarchy, no patriarchy. I think that is important, but I know that I'll still run into trouble for drawing from religious, spiritual kind of ancestry. What have I missed? Okay, I think this bit's quite important. I think that a lot of the people that I'm working with in the specific instance of our monastery see a kind of historical parallel between what the emergence of early monasticism in terms of these kind of strange individuals going out into the desert, very, very far out from civilization, and having these kind of insane visions. And it might be said that there's a kind of historical analog to people like Julian Assange or other cypherpunks, Jacob Applebaum, etc., who sat in their basement on their laptop and stepped very, very far out from what we conceive of society, or what some people refer to as in real life. And they had visions of a way in which society might be structured. And they spent a long time on their laptops in strange forums, like many people did spend a very long time in the desert having visions. And when they came back to society, they felt that they might be able to express those visions. And they came into a certain kind of conflict that is not dissimilar to the early formations of the monasteries across the Nile. That may or may not be true. Okay, other things about why the monastery is particularly interesting in that same vein. How much time do I have?
2 minutes.
Are you serious?
5.
5, okay, I'll go really quickly. Okay, so the other so there's something about hackerspaces that's quite important to say, maybe before I make the analog to the Benedictine rule. So hackerspaces have been able to spread as a result of something called pattern languages, which is a non-specific solution to a common problem. So an example of which would be, I live in a house of 10 people. When the post arrives, the post always gets lost. The solution is put a shelf next to the door and tell people that that's where the post should go, and then the post isn't lost. So this is the way in which hackerspaces were able to spread across the world on a decentralized basis, because the knowledge was stored in these little non-specific pods and then put together by different people in different circumstances. This was part of Christopher Alexander's cybernetic dream. It goes into object-oriented programming and then comes back out in hackerspaces. Now, the Benedictine rule is super interesting in this respect, and in a way is the kind of precursor to much of this cybernetic thought. The Benedictine rule is composed of 73 rules that describe the way in which you might live together in a building. It actually doesn't say that much about God, although it is kind of drenched in references to scripture, etc. Skip that bit. Skip that bit. Okay, so the prototype. So we actually did this. We didn't just think about it. Somehow, the city of Matera in southern Italy liked what we were proposing. So I mean, we put a website online, we said this is our vision, and we had some connections to the city, and they said, we like the sound of this, would you like to come and do it here? And there was a specific reason for that, because the city of Matera was trying to build from a bottom-up position their bid for European capital of culture on principles of a kind of open future. And this kind of flies in the face of the history of the European capital of culture, which for the most part was predicated on imported spectacle. What they were interested in was a citizen participation process. They were interested in open sourcing their existing data and processes, and they were interested particularly in this kind of idea of an ancient future, of the knowledge that may have potentially been lost in the last 100 years of development. Matera is a particularly interesting case in this respect, because up until the 60s or the 70s, it was one of the longest inhabited, constantly inhabited places on the earth. Should I stop? Maybe I'll just finish on what we did. Okay, so when we were in Matera and we ran the prototype, there were a couple of different projects that we did. We ran a series of public meetings with citizens in the city to kind of try and identify challenges. And now this is something that we've kind of thrown thrown out as a process that doesn't really work, but it did lead to a number of interesting projects. So one of the issues was there was no intergenerational space in the city. So we tried to establish a series of open coding workshops, one of which is called Coder Dojo. It's a way of teaching kids to program or using games. And in October of last year, we ran a session where we taught 1,000 children to code in a school. We ran a project to map all of the different transport routes in the city and make that data freely available and lobby the local government or local municipality to release as much data as possible about finances, etc. We did another project where we tried to develop a new kind of energy generation that draws on high altitude winds called Kaider wind. And then I just skip all those other bits and then just say where we are at the moment. So where we are at the moment is we moved to Athens at the beginning of this year, partly because of the situation in terms of the collapse of the European project, and we felt like that was an important place to be, but also we foresaw that there was going to be an unfolding humanitarian crisis. And the project has become quite stretched and difficult because so many people who are involved in our monastery are on the ground trying to work in that situation. But quite unexpectedly in the last month or so, we've had a number of people come forward that want to start our monasteries in different cities and places in the world, and so we are working with them towards that. Thank you. I think I used up all my time.
Are there any questions? Yes.
So when people write you to, you know, I mean, if they want to establish a monastery, I guess, in a city, they write to you and then they have to find their own finance or have relations with the local, I mean, does the local government have to give permission, or how is that process working? I mean, what is the relationship you have with the local government and with, as far as finance goes?
So
I really loved this. I must say, I loved your talk and I also loved the project. So, yeah.
Tricky one. I think it's similar to the way that hackerspaces are established and monasteries in general, that there isn't a set pattern that makes sense at this time. So initially, it's a kind of ad hoc response. So somebody recently contacted us who's based in upstate New York. They've been speaking to the Shaker movement, who have this like empty building that's called the Abode, and there might be the potential to make some kind of deal. So what we found is, particularly in a rural setting, when you have the collapse of small villages and towns, that if you could guarantee that you were going to turn up with 10 to 20 people that were going to do interesting projects, generally people will at very least give you land and property. We started the project thinking land and property was the problem. It actually turns out that people are the problem. So there's not like a specific route to achieving this. But what I anticipate is kind of in the open source development process is that you iterate each time and you work out what is effective. So in the instance of hackerspaces, it wasn't until MetaLab in Vienna developed a replicable funding model in 2016 that you were able to suddenly have this explosion of spaces. So we're moving slowly.
But your objective is not to make world and monastery. I mean, you are also living one life, one form of life within those connections that are made randomly. These other monasteries develop. So you don't have a plan of world expansion? Or?
There's definitely no central authority. I think that it might seem like a cop-out, but we're trying to build the project in such a way that if like in 3 or 4 years' time, something went very wrong with either the identity of the project or we decided to move away from it, that all of the documentation and work that we've done could be translated into other projects. So, and that's also a kind of mandate for the work, is that it's well documented so people can take the bits that they want and use it for their projects. And I think that one of the probably one of the most radical potentials for using design patterns is that you can build one thing with a set of components that looks like a monastery or a hackerspace or whatever else. And then at some point in the future, you might take those components and build something slightly different that nobody could have seen you build in that moment. And if people adopt a particular form of documentation that can work across projects, whether it be satellite ground stations or new software, etc., those things could be put together to build something entirely, I wouldn't say new.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more question. Four?
Quick one.
4 questions.
3, okay, so. So first, one of the first things that you said, and this is a conversation that we've had for quite a long time, is that one of the criticisms that's sometimes waged at these kinds of ways of structuring projects is that they go towards a kind of libertarian edge. So because you mentioned it, I thought it'd be worth just asking you to just say a little bit more about that. Secondly, super quickly, just seeing where these projects seem to be cropping up, there is a kind of like an economic placement of those locations vis-a-vis the world. So I was wondering whether you had any experience of people contacting the project from, you know, places in the world which aren't, let's say, Portugal, the US.
For
Germany.
example, places of conflict.
For instance, places of conflict.
Or the so-called global south.
Yeah, exactly. The economic south, because Australia is pretty south. Thirdly, and this is purely curiosity, is I was going to ask you how the project is run from the point of view of authority share or non-authority sharing, but maybe that's a really long answer. It requires a really long answer. But in the meantime, I just wanted to know whether you'd noticed in the component parts of the project, meaning the people that are currently involved in it, a specific kind of demographic representation being stronger than others, gender, you know, whatever, and how and whether that was like being thought about as the project developed. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Quite a few questions. So the libertarian one, I would say, and it was kind of identified in the description of this kind of overall conference, that there was a potential rise in a libertarianism on the right and the left, and I think that is undoubtedly true. I think that it's interesting in the instance of, say, something like Bitcoin, that the anarchists and the libertarians have essentially worked together in order to build this technology, and now the libertarians are finding out that although you build a completely decentralized currency, that the libertarian utopia isn't possible. So I think within that arch, but then on the other side, the kind of Silicon Valley route of a potential kind of libertarian utopia or reformation, I think is totally possible and it's something to be fought against. And I very much see this work as acting as a kind of grinding stone against the values and the souls of people in Silicon Valley in a longer term. So the people who fall out of Google and Apple and places like that and
have a place to go.
Have a place to go. Like a basement worth living in. Okay, the next question was the one on
Global South.
the global south.
And
So
places of conflict.
and places of conflict. Okay, so I think the way that I would respond to that question is that it's very much symptomatic of the nature of the internet, in this idea that we, as a result of global connectivity, that we've somehow broken down the barriers between all individuals and groups, and therefore we are in some ways like more connected, and we have this potential for a kind of universality, which I think is completely untrue. And I think that within the context of a monastery, we are limited by our limited resources and our scope and our networks, but that is something that continues to grow. In terms of specific instances of, I guess it's very difficult to reach those situations because these cultures, like the culture of open source, etc., is very different in another instance. So India has a very different approach to kind of ad hoc. It has its own kind of intentional technology movement, And these two things aren't able to actually talk to each other at the moment. So it's like you do have these kind of different tribes or groups that haven't yet really met each other.
But I think they're all over the world. I mean, Ben Vickers is here as one example. But if one thinks of Ashok and China in India and the development of Padma and some of the projects around there, there are similarities and analogies. So I think it's fine if in a certain phase these things are all floating around on their own within the human situated lives that we have and the people that we meet, rather than like trying to forcibly open up a Lufthansa office in every city of the world.